The doorbell rang at exactly midnight. I stood in the foyer of my own home staring at my husband Andre and his 19-year-old daughter. Brianna had two enormous suitcases flanking her designer sneakers. She pushed past me, dropping the heavy bags onto my pristine hardwood floors. "Dad said I am moving in," she announced. Before I could even process the intrusion, she shoved a crumpled piece of paper against my chest. It was a list. Breakfast at exactly 7, no greasy food, fresh sheets every single week, clean my bathroom every night, hand wash my school clothes, iron them, hang them, never fold them. I turned to look at my husband, expecting him to intervene. He stood on the stairs completely silent, looking away. He chose her side without speaking a single word. I looked back at the list, folded it neatly, and smiled. Okay. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through disrespect while secretly holding all the cards. The rain was coming down hard when that doorbell rang, echoing through our quiet Atlanta suburb. We lived in a sprawling brick estate in Cascade, an area famous for established Black wealth. Andre loved to show off this house to his friends, but I was the one who actually maintained it. I had spent the entire evening reviewing commercial lease agreements in my home office, carefully maintaining the illusion that I was just a regular real estate appraiser doing extra paperwork. Andre, my husband of 5 years, had gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion from his high-pressure job as a wealth manager. He always loved to remind me how exhausting it was to manage other people and their millions. He loved preaching about Black excellence and building generational wealth. Yet when the heavy pounding on our front door startled me, he did not rush down to protect our home. He strolled down the stairs in his silk pajamas, looking entirely too calm for a midnight emergency. I opened the heavy oak door. Brianna stood under the porch light with rain misting around her. She did not say hello. She did not apologize for the hour. She simply dragged her oversized suitcases over the threshold, letting the wet wheels leave mud across the rug I had just cleaned. I asked her what she was doing here. She rolled her eyes, a gesture she had perfected since she was a child, and looked right past me to her father. She told me Dad said she was moving in. She handed me the chore list as if I were a hired maid who had just clocked in for the night shift. I read the demands written in her looping handwriting. Hand wash my school clothes, iron them, hang them, never fold them. I was 36 years old. I had built a life for myself, yet here I was, being handed a chore list by a college dropout who thought the world owed her a living. I looked at Andre. I waited for the man who promised to cherish and respect me to step forward and tell his daughter that this was not how we treat family. I waited for him to tear up the list and tell her to carry her own bags upstairs. Andre slowly descended the last few steps. He rubbed the back of his neck, refusing to meet my eyes. He said Brianna was going through a tough time and needed a stable environment. He said she needed structure, and that my schedule as an appraiser was flexible enough to accommodate her needs. I asked him if accommodating her needs meant becoming her personal servant in my own house. Brianna let out a loud, dramatic sigh. She complained that she could not deal with this negative energy. She told her father she needed her silk blouses washed by tomorrow morning for a brunch date with her friends. She specifically instructed me to use cold water and line dry them, acting as if I lacked basic comprehension. I stared at the silk blouses spilling out of her poorly packed suitcase. I told them I did not have the right detergent for delicate fabrics, fully expecting Andre to tell her to wash them herself or wait until morning. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his luxury robe and pulled out his money clip. He slid out a crisp $10 bill and flicked it across the foyer table. It fluttered and landed right next to my hand. "Take that and buy some premium detergent in the morning," Andre said, his voice dripping with that familiar, condescending tone he saved for when he wanted to remind me of my place. He said Brianna was born into a different standard of living. He said I grew up in a cramped neighborhood and was used to cutting corners, but his daughter was not. He told me to stop embarrassing the family and just do as I was asked. He told me to use his money to buy something decent for once in my life. $10. He was trying to buy my dignity, my labor, and my silence for $10. Brianna smirked, picking up her phone to text her friends, completely ignoring the fact that she had just turned my home into her personal hotel. Andre kissed her forehead, picked up one of her bags, and carried it up the stairs, leaving me alone in the foyer with a chore list, a pile of dirty laundry, and a crisp piece of currency. I did not scream. I did not throw the $10 bill back in his face. Emotional outbursts were exactly what they expected from me. They expected the angry, defensive woman who would prove their point about my supposed lack of class. I picked up the $10 bill. I smoothed out the corners. I picked up Brianna and her heavy suitcase and dragged the remaining items into the laundry room. I stood under the harsh, fluorescent light of the utility room, sorting through her clothes. She bought cheap, fast fashion garments that merely looked expensive, imitating a wealth she did not actually possess. Her father did the exact same thing. Andre projected an image of immense wealth, leasing luxury cars and wearing custom suits. But I knew the truth. I always knew the truth. I grabbed the laundry detergent. I washed the shirts, I ironed the skirts, I hung them up, every fold, every crease, every humiliation smoothed out perfectly. I washed the shirts, I ironed the skirts, I hung them up, every fold, every crease, every humiliation smoothed out perfectly. I moved the iron back and forth across the fabric, letting the steam rise into the air. I let the rhythmic motion calm my racing mind. They thought I was a simple real estate appraiser. They thought I spent my days measuring square footage and writing reports for minor commissions. They did not know that the appraisal firm was just a front. They did not know that I owned the commercial building where Andre rented his flashy wealth management office. They did not know that I was the founder and majority shareholder of a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring distressed assets. I managed millions of dollars in acquisitions, and my husband had just tossed me $10 to buy laundry detergent. I washed the shirts, I ironed the skirts, I hung them up, every fold, every crease, every humiliation smoothed out perfectly. I finished the laundry just as the sun began to rise. The physical labor was exhausting, but it kept my mind exceptionally sharp. I carried the perfectly pressed garments upstairs and hung them on the door handle of the guest bedroom. I walked into the kitchen and began preparing the breakfast Brianna had demanded. No greasy food. I poached eggs, I sliced avocados, I crushed the soft green fruit with a fork, watching it yield under pressure. I arranged everything on a plate with absolute precision. I was playing the role they assigned me flawlessly. Because when you are preparing to destroy someone and their entire existence, the greatest weapon you have is their absolute certainty that they are in control. At 7 o'clock sharp, I set the breakfast on the dining table. Brianna stumbled downstairs, grabbed the plate without a single word of thanks, and retreated back to her room. Andre came down shortly after, dressed in a sharp navy suit. He grabbed a cup of coffee and nodded at me, completely ignoring the events of the previous night. He acted as if treating me like the hired help was perfectly normal. He told me to clean his home office while he was at work today. He said he had some important clients coming over later this week and needed the space to look immaculate. He told me not to touch the papers on his desk. I smiled and told him to have a wonderful day at work. I waited until his car pulled out of the driveway. I watched the taillights disappear down the street. I waited until I heard the shower running in Brianna and her bathroom. Then I walked into Andre and his home office. The room was a monument to his fragile ego. Framed degrees, fake awards, and expensive leather furniture designed to intimidate visitors. I began dusting the shelves, moving methodically around the room. I respected his boundaries. I did not touch the papers on top of his desk. But he never said anything about the locked drawer at the bottom of his filing cabinet. Andre was arrogant, but he was not particularly smart. He kept the spare key to that cabinet taped underneath his desk lamp. I retrieved the key, slid it into the lock, and pulled the heavy metal drawer open. It was mostly filled with old tax returns and expired warranties. But tucked all the way in the back, hidden beneath a stack of blank folders, was a thick manila envelope from our mortgage lender. We had paid off this house 2 years ago using funds I had quietly transferred into our joint account under the guise of an unexpected work bonus. There was absolutely no reason for us to receive a package this thick from a mortgage lender. I pulled the envelope out. My hands were perfectly steady as I opened the clasp, and slid the documents onto the floor. It was a home equity line of credit approval, a massive, staggering loan against the very house I was standing in. I scanned the numbers printed in bold black ink. $1.5 million. Andre had taken out a $1.5 million loan against our home. I flipped rapidly to the final page of the contract. There, right next to Andre and his signature, was my own name. The handwriting mimicked my signature almost perfectly. The loops, the slant, the pressure points. Someone had spent hours practicing how to forge my name. Someone had stolen my financial identity to pull $1.5 million in cash out of the equity of my home. I stared at the forged signature. The silence in the house was deafening. Andre had not just disrespected me by bringing his entitled daughter here. He had not just insulted me with a $10 bill. He had committed federal bank fraud. He had tethered my name to a massive, crushing debt without my knowledge. I looked closer at the notary stamp on the document. It belonged to a woman who worked at Andre and his firm. They had colluded to bypass the legal requirement of having me physically present to sign the papers. The betrayal ran deeper than just a desperate husband needing cash. It was a calculated, orchestrated effort to leverage my safety and my property for his own gain. He thought I was just a naive appraiser who would never understand the complex financial documents hiding in his desk. He thought my working-class background made me too ignorant to question his authority. He had no idea that I spent my entire professional life hunting down financial fraud and tearing apart bad investments. I carefully placed the documents back into the envelope. I locked the drawer and taped the key back under the lamp exactly where I found it. I walked out of the office and pulled my phone from my pocket. I did not call the police. I did not call my husband to scream at him. I called my private wealth manager at my equity firm. I told him we had a new target for acquisition. The game had completely changed, and Andre had no idea he was already playing against the house. Thursday arrived with the smell of cheap cologne and expensive lies. Andre stood by the front door adjusting his silk tie. He announced he had a late client dinner. He told Brianna she could order whatever she wanted on his card. He looked at me and told me to stay out of her way. He said his daughter needed space to breathe. He walked out. The heavy oak door clicked shut. Clicked. Exactly 12 minutes later, the bass started. It vibrated through the floorboards of the living room. Cars pulled into the driveway. Car doors slammed. Voices echoed across the manicured lawn. Brianna had not wasted a single second. She had invited her friends over the moment her father left. They walked through the front door without knocking. They wore muddy sneakers on my Persian rugs. They carried cheap bottles of liquor in plastic bags. I sat at the kitchen island. I had my laptop open. I was reviewing the preliminary documents from my wealth manager. The plan to acquire Andre and his fraudulent debt was in motion. I needed to focus, but the noise was deafening. I did not retreat to my bedroom. I did not hide in the dark. I stayed right there in the center of the house. I watched them invade my space. Brianna walked into the kitchen. She had 4 friends trailing behind her. They looked at me like I was a stranger sitting in a coffee shop. Brianna opened my wine fridge. She bypassed the cheap bottles and reached for a vintage Cabernet I had been saving for 5 years. She did not ask. She simply pulled the cork out and poured the dark red liquid into a massive crystal glass. I told her to put this bottle back. She laughed. Her friends giggled behind their hands. She walked over to the kitchen island where I was working. She stood directly across from me. She held the crystal glass loosely in her hand. She said her father paid for everything in this house. She said her father told her she could have whatever she wanted. She took a step closer. The glass tilted. It was not an accident. I saw her look at the keyboard. I saw her loosen her grip. The heavy glass tipped forward. A wave of dark red wine cascaded directly over my open laptop. The liquid splashed across the keys. It seeped into the vents. The screen flickered violently. The digital display distorted into a chaotic mess of colors before snapping to pitch black. A thin trail of smoke curled up from the trackpad. The smell of burning plastic mixed with the scent of fermented grapes. "Oops," Brianna said. Her voice was flat and entirely devoid of regret. "Send the bill to my dad." Her friends erupted into laughter. They thought it was the funniest thing they had ever seen. The rich girl putting the working-class stepmother in her place. I did not scream. I did not lunge across the island. I slowly reached out and pulled the power cord from the outlet. I closed the lid of the ruined machine. The wine dripped off the edges of the aluminum casing and pooled on the white marble countertop. I looked at Brianna. I told her to get a towel. I told her to clean up the mess she just made. She crossed her arms and smirked. She told me cleaning was my job. She said that was the only reason her father kept me around. She turned her back to me and started walking toward the living room with her friends. The front door swung open. Andre walked in. He had forgotten a file for his supposed client dinner. He stopped in the entryway. He saw the teenagers. He heard the loud music. He smelled the alcohol. A normal father would have stopped the party. A normal husband would have demanded respect for his home. Andre did neither. He smiled. He walked into the kitchen and gave Brianna a high five. He acted like the cool older brother instead of a parent. Then he saw me standing at the island. He saw the puddle of red wine. He saw the smoking laptop. "What happened here?" Andre asked. His tone was already accusatory. He was already preparing to blame me. I told him his daughter poured a glass of wine directly onto my workstation. I told him my device was destroyed. I told him I expected her to clean it up and replace it immediately. Andre sighed loudly. He pinched the bridge of his nose like I was giving him a massive headache. He looked at the ruined machine and then looked at me with absolute disgust. "It is a cheap computer, Lydia," he said. His voice was loud enough for Brianna and her friends to hear. "It is a piece of plastic. Stop acting like the world is ending. My daughter is trying to relax with her friends, and you are harassing her over a basic accident." I stared at him. I reminded him that my entire livelihood was on that machine. I told him I needed it for work. Andre reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his wallet. He pulled out 5 crisp $100 bills and threw them onto the puddle of wine on the counter. The red liquid immediately began soaking into the paper money. "Go buy another cheap laptop tomorrow," he commanded. "Stop being so petty. You are embarrassing yourself in front of the kids." He turned his back on me. He walked over to Brianna. He pulled out more cash from his wallet. He handed it to her friends. He told them to order the most expensive pizzas in the city. He told them the night was on him. He smiled and laughed, soaking up their adoration. They cheered for him. They told him he was the best dad ever. I watched the entire pathetic performance. Andre always used money to buy affection. He used cash to mask his profound incompetence as a father and a man. He could not provide discipline or genuine love, so he provided pizza and permissive boundaries. He thought he looked wealthy and generous. I knew he was bleeding dry. I knew the cash he was handing to those teenagers came from the fraudulent loan he had taken out against my house. He was buying their cheers with stolen money. He walked back out the front door to resume his fake business dinner. He left me standing in the kitchen with a ruined laptop, a puddle of wine, and a house full of disrespectful teenagers. I wiped the marble counter. I threw away the stained paper towels. I picked up the wet $100 bills and dropped them into the trash can. I did not need his stolen money. I wiped the counter again. I dried the floor. I watched them laugh. I watched him dig his own grave. I wiped the counter. I dried the floor. I watched them laugh. I watched him dig his own grave. Every swipe of the cloth was a promise. Every drop of wine cleaned up was a vow of absolute ruin. The next morning, the house was dead quiet. Brianna was sleeping off her night of partying. I packed the ruined laptop into my leather bag. It was not a cheap computer. It was a highly specialized encrypted workstation issued by my private equity firm. It contained classified financial data, sensitive acquisition targets, and my digital authorization codes. I drove downtown to a discreet commercial building. I bypassed the public reception and took the private elevator to the basement level. My firm retained a forensic data recovery specialist for situations involving damaged hardware. His name was Marcus. He was a quiet man who rarely spoke unless it was strictly necessary. I handed him the wine-soaked machine. I told him what happened. I told him I needed the hard drive cloned and transferred to a new secure device by noon. He took the machine without a word and carried it into his clean room. I sat in the waiting area drinking black coffee. I went over my timeline. The bank fraud was actively being investigated by my team. The acquisition of Andre and his debt was moving through the final compliance checks. I was methodically dismantling his life while he thought I was crying over a spilled glass of wine. My phone vibrated. It was a message from Andre. He told me to make sure Brianna had a hot breakfast ready when she woke up. He told me to use the money he left on the counter to buy better groceries. I deleted the message. The door to the clean room opened. Marcus walked out. He was holding my ruined laptop in one hand and a clear plastic evidence bag in the other. He did not look happy. He sat down across from me and placed the items on the glass table. "The wine damage is superficial, Ms. Lydia," he said. His voice was low and extremely serious. "I salvaged the hard drive without any data loss. The casing took the brunt of the liquid." I thanked him and reached for the new drive. Marcus pulled his hand back slightly, stopping me. "That is not the problem," he continued. "When I ran the diagnostic check on the motherboard, I found a hardware modification. I asked him what he meant. I asked if the wine caused a short circuit." Marcus shook his head. He pointed to the clear plastic bag. Inside was a tiny microscopic piece of hardware. It looked like a fragmented computer chip. "Someone physically opened your laptop casing," Ms. Lydia, Marcus said. "The screws on the bottom panel show signs of tampering. This device was installed directly onto your motherboard. It is a highly sophisticated keystroke logger and screen capture device. It bypasses your encryption software entirely." The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. I stared at the tiny chip in the bag. I asked him how long it had been there. Marcus checked his tablet. "The device was installed yesterday afternoon between 2 and 4 o'clock. He looked up at me. His eyes were grave. "The spyware was programmed to isolate and harvest your electronic signatures and banking authorizations. Someone was actively stealing your digital identity right before the wine was spilled." I sat back in my chair. The puzzle pieces violently slammed into place. Brianna did not spill the wine because she was a careless, arrogant teenager. The spill was not an accident to humiliate me. The spill was a deliberate, calculated action. The wine was meant to destroy the laptop. It was meant to short out the motherboard completely. It was meant to permanently fry the physical evidence of the spyware they had installed hours earlier. Andre and his daughter were not just disrespectful. They were a coordinated criminal enterprise. They needed my digital signatures to authorize more fraudulent loans. They needed my banking access to drain whatever funds they could find. And they tried to drown the evidence in a glass of vintage Cabernet. I looked at Marcus. I asked him if he could trace where the harvested data was sent before the wine shut the system down. He nodded. It transmitted a single packet of data to an external server before the liquid shorted the battery. I traced the server IP address. He slid a piece of paper across the table. I read the name of the tech startup registered to that server. It belonged to Connor, my white brother-in-law, the man who thought I was nothing but a working-class appraiser, the man who Andre was secretly funding with my stolen home equity. They were all in on it together. I folded the piece of paper and put it in my pocket. I took the new hard drive from Marcus. I walked out of the building and got into my car. The sun was shining brightly over the city. I started the engine. The game was no longer just about taking my husband down. The entire family was going to burn. I drove back to the Cascade Estate. The afternoon sun was blistering hot over the city of Atlanta. The air conditioning in my car blasted cold air against my face, but my blood was boiling. I pulled into the wide, circular driveway just as a catering delivery van was pulling out. Andre had insisted on hosting a massive family cookout this weekend. He called it a celebration of family unity and Black excellence. I knew it was nothing more than an elaborate theatrical performance designed to stroke his fragile ego. I walked through the heavy front doors. The house already smelled of expensive imported cigars and cheap entitlement. I walked straight past the grand staircase and went directly into the kitchen. I began preparing the side dishes for the afternoon. I chopped the fresh vegetables. I marinated the expensive cuts of meat. My hands moved with absolute mechanical precision, while my mind processed the reality of the tiny, fragmented computer chip currently sitting in my pocket. The malicious spyware, the stolen digital signature, the $1.5 million of fraudulent debt anchored firmly to my home. The doorbell rang sharp and loud. Vivian walked in. The mother of my husband was 62 years old, but she dressed like a woman desperately clinging to a bygone era of high society. She wore a wide-brimmed linen hat and an oversized pearl necklace that clacked loudly against her chest when she walked. She strolled past me without offering a single word of greeting. She ran her bare index finger along the edge of the mahogany entryway console table, checking for invisible dust. Vivian looked at my simple black sundress and sighed very loudly. She asked if I was planning to change my clothes before the real guests arrived. She said I looked like I was ready to serve tables at a downtown diner instead of hosting my husband and his prestigious, wealthy family. She told me to fix my hair because it looked unkempt and embarrassing. I smiled at my mother-in-law. I told her I was just making sure the kitchen was perfectly prepped for her arrival. I took her coat. I hung it up in the hall closet. I swallowed the bitter insult. An hour later, Olivia and Connor arrived. Olivia was the younger sister of Andre. She was a deeply quiet woman who kept her head down and let her husband do all the talking. Connor was 38 years old. He was a white man who had married into a wealthy black family and walked around our neighborhood like he held the physical deed to our entire culture. He wore a crisp pink polo shirt, tailored khaki shorts, and expensive leather boat shoes without socks. Connor strolled right into the center of my kitchen and immediately began inspecting the massive spread of food I had spent the entire morning preparing. He picked up a pair of silver tongs and poked aggressively at the seasoned ribs resting on the marble counter. He sniffed the air critically. He looked at me and asked where I sourced the pork. I told him I went to the local family-owned butcher down the street. Connor let out a loud, condescending chuckle. He looked at Andre, who had just walked into the kitchen to greet him. Connor shook his head and said that people who do not understand generational wealth simply do not understand basic culinary quality. He launched into a long, uninvited lecture about grass-fed Wagyu beef, sustainable farming, and imported Japanese marinades. He spoke very slowly and very loudly as if I had severe trouble understanding basic English concepts. He explained that in his world, in the elite tech startup world, they only accept the absolute pinnacle of perfection. Andre nodded eagerly. My husband, the man who was actively stealing my identity, looked at Connor with pure, unadulterated admiration. Andre agreed with him completely. Andre told Connor that I was still adjusting to the luxury lifestyle. Andre said, "You can take the girl out of the working class, but you cannot take the working class out of the girl." They both laughed loudly. Vivian joined in the laughter from her comfortable seat in the living room. Olivia just stared at the kitchen floor. Brianna came downstairs trailing 3 of her loud friends behind her. She did not say hello to her grandmother or her aunt. She looked directly at me and told me they needed fresh rolled towels by the pool immediately. She ordered me to bring out a large pitcher of iced sweet tea and make sure it had extra lemon. I grabbed the fresh towels. I made the sweet tea. I carried the heavy silver tray out to the pool deck. I served the cold drinks to the teenagers. I collected the empty glasses from the adults. I wiped the condensation off the glass patio tables. Every smile was a careful mathematical calculation. Every obedient nod was a steel trap being set. I watched them lounge in my expensive backyard. I watched them swim in my pristine pool. I watched them act like royalty while I played the role of the loyal, obedient servant. Later in the afternoon, everyone gathered on the expansive stone patio for the main meal. Connor stood up at the head of the table and tapped his silver fork against his crystal water glass. He demanded the absolute attention of everyone. He wrapped his arm tightly around Olivia and announced that his new tech startup was on the verge of a massive global breakthrough. He threw around meaningless corporate buzzwords like synergy and disruptive algorithms and massive capital injection. Connor looked directly across the table at me. He smiled a thin, arrogant little smile. He said that venture capital is how real, staggering wealth is generated in this country. He said it takes pure vision and supreme intellectual intelligence to navigate the high finance tech sector. He said it was a little more complicated than measuring square footage and writing basic appraisal reports for minor real estate commissions. Vivian clapped her hands together in delight. Andre raised his glass of bourbon in a toast to his brilliant brother-in-law. I quietly gathered the dirty porcelain plates. I stacked them perfectly in my arms. I carried them into the quiet kitchen. I scraped the leftover food and bones into the large garbage bin. The plastic trash bag was completely full. I tied the red drawstrings tightly together and hauled the heavy black bag out the side door of the kitchen. The side door opened into a narrow brick alleyway that ran directly behind the outdoor kitchen and the massive stainless steel grill Andre loved to show off to his friends. The sun was beginning to set over the house, casting long, dark shadows across the warm red bricks. I walked softly. My flat shoes did not make a single sound on the pavement. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still behind a thick, sprawling wall of green climbing ivy. I could smell the heavy, pungent smoke of imported cigars drifting over the brick wall. I could hear their voices. Andre and Connor were standing right on the other side of the ivy, hiding from the rest of the family. Their voices were hushed, but the evening air was dead quiet, and I could hear every single word they said. Andre was speaking first. His voice lacked its usual booming, arrogant confidence. He sounded nervous. He sounded incredibly desperate. He asked Connor if the legal paperwork for the commercial lease was finalized. He asked if the new corporate headquarters was officially secured. Connor laughed. It was a cold, calculating sound that sent a shiver down my spine. He told Andre to relax his nerves. Connor said the commercial lease was ready to be signed, but the property management company required a massive cash deposit by Tuesday morning. Connor asked Andre if the capital was fully liquid and ready to transfer. Connor said he could not afford any bank delays because his elite venture partners were getting extremely anxious. I held my breath. I pressed my back hard against the warm brick wall. Andre took a deep, heavy drag of his cigar. I heard him exhale a thick cloud of smoke. He told Connor the funds were completely secure. Andre said he had exactly $1.5 million in clean, untraceable cash, ready to wire directly into the startup account on Monday morning. He bragged about how incredibly easy it was. He said the bank approved the home equity line of credit without asking any difficult questions. Connor chuckled again. He told Andre he was genuinely impressed. Connor said he honestly did not think Andre had the courage or the stomach to pull that much equity out of the house behind the back of his own wife. Connor asked if I suspected anything at all. Connor asked if the specialized spyware he provided actually worked as intended. My heart turned to absolute solid ice. The tiny fragmented computer chip in my pocket suddenly felt like a burning coal against my leg. Connor was the one who supplied the keystroke logger. Connor, the arrogant white tech brother, was the actual architect of the digital theft against me. Andre laughed confidently. He said I was completely and utterly clueless. He said I was too busy washing the dirty laundry of his daughter and worrying about my little real estate appraisal job to ever check the deep financial records of the house. Andre said his contact at the wealth management firm pushed the official notary stamp through without me needing to be physically present. He said the signature was an absolutely perfect match, harvested directly from my encrypted work laptop. Andre said I was a good domestic wife, but I simply lacked the mental capacity to ever understand high-level corporate finance. Connor strongly agreed. Connor said the elite tech sector does not wait for working-class women to catch up to reality. Connor promised Andre a permanent seat on the board of directors once the startup officially went public. He told Andre that this $1.5 million early investment was going to make them both richer and more powerful than they could ever imagine. I heard the sharp clink of crystal glasses touching. They were congratulating themselves on their sheer, unadulterated brilliance. I stood in the dark shadows of the alleyway. The heavy garbage bag cut painfully into my fingers. The stench of rotting food and discarded waste filled my nose. It smelled exactly like the two men standing on the other side of the brick wall. Everything made perfect, absolute sense now. Andre did not just steal from me to pay off his flashy secret credit card debts. He stole my digital identity and leveraged my property because he wanted to play in the big leagues. He wanted to be a tech investor. He wanted to sit at the executive table with white venture capitalists like Connor. He was so desperate for external validation and status that he risked federal prison and the total destruction of our marriage. And Connor knew exactly how to exploit that pathetic desperation to fund his own company. I did not scream. I did not step around the ivy wall and confront them in a fit of blind rage. I did not throw the garbage bag at their tailored suits and demand my money back. Emotional confrontation is for people who lack real leverage. I had all the leverage in the entire world. They were celebrating a commercial lease on a massive building that my anonymous holding company owned. They were relying entirely on a fraudulent loan that my private equity firm was currently in the process of acquiring. They thought they were the apex predators. They did not realize they were already caught firmly in the jaws of my trap. I walked slowly and silently to the outdoor trash bins. I dropped the heavy black bag inside. The plastic lid closed with a quiet, muffled thud. I walked back through the side door and stepped into my pristine kitchen. I turned on the sink. I washed my hands. The freezing cold water ran over my skin, chilling me, bringing me back to absolute perfect focus. I dried my hands on a fresh linen towel. I looked out the large kitchen window. Brianna was pushing one of her loud friends into the deep end of the pool, laughing hysterically. Vivian was sitting on a padded lounge chair, complaining to Olivia about the evening humidity. Andre and Connor emerged from the side patio, puffing on their thick cigars, looking like absolute kings, surveying their newly conquered empire. I grabbed a silver tray. I walked back outside, holding a fresh platter of sliced seasonal fruit. I smiled warmly at Vivian. I offered a thick slice of cold watermelon to Connor. I asked Andre if he needed another pour of his expensive bourbon. I played my assigned part flawlessly. I was the obedient domestic wife. I was the simple working-class appraiser. I was the foolish woman they thought they could easily crush under their expensive designer shoes. I watched them eat my food. I watched them swim in my pool. I watched them laugh and boast and plan their magnificent, wealthy future using my stolen money. I let them enjoy the beautiful afternoon. I let them feel utterly powerful and completely invincible. Because when the ground finally opened up and swallowed them all whole, I wanted them to fall from the absolute highest possible peak. The rest of the week played out exactly as I anticipated. Andre swaggered around the house with the inflated chest of a man who believed he had just outsmarted the entire financial system. He bought a new custom-tailored suit. He wore expensive cologne that filled the hallways with the scent of unearned confidence. He looked at me with open disgust every time he passed the kitchen where I sat pretending to endlessly scroll through online job boards. He told Brianna she could plan a massive weekend getaway with her friends because he was about to close a deal that would secure their family legacy forever. He spoke loudly on his phone, making sure I heard him use words like elite partnerships and massive capital gains. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to feel utterly dependent and terrified of the future. I sat at the kitchen island staring at a blank screen. I made sure my shoulders were hunched. I made sure my eyes looked tired. I played the role of the discarded burden flawlessly. I watched him pour a glass of imported scotch and toast his own reflection in the hallway mirror. He was celebrating a victory that did not exist. He was celebrating his entry into a world he was completely unequipped to navigate. Brianna took her father and his arrogance as a direct license to escalate her own abuse. She stopped handing me lists and started leaving notes taped to the appliances. She left her dirty dishes stacked precariously in the sink. She dropped wet towels on the hardwood floors, knowing I would pick them up to prevent the wood from warping. She treated my impending unemployment as a joke. She told her friends over the phone that her stepmother was basically a glorified maid who was about to be put out on the street. I picked up the wet towels. I washed the dishes. I scrubbed the counters. I absorbed the disrespect. I cataloged every single insult. Every sneer was another lock on the door I was about to slam shut on their lives. On Thursday morning, my secure phone buzzed. It was David. I walked out to the patio and answered the call. David informed me that the property management company had officially processed the commercial lease for Connor and his startup. The deposit had cleared. The funds were securely resting in my holding company accounts. David said Connor was moving incredibly fast. Connor had already hired an elite interior design firm to furnish the top floor of the high-rise. He was pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into imported Italian leather chairs, glass conference tables, and custom lighting fixtures. He was burning through the stolen home equity at an astonishing rate to create the illusion of an established, successful tech empire. David told me that Connor and Andre were planning a massive showcase event for the following week. They were inviting 3 major venture capital firms to tour the new headquarters. They wanted to secure a massive second round of funding based on the prototype software and the sheer prestige of their new physical location. David said the venture capitalists were serious players in the industry. They were men who controlled billions in liquid assets. They were exactly the kind of people Connor needed to validate his existence. I listened to the details. A slow, meticulous plan formed in my mind. I told David I wanted full access to the building during the showcase event. I told him I did not want to walk in as the landlord. I wanted to be invisible. I wanted to be right in the middle of their triumph without them ever realizing I was holding the trigger. I instructed David to contact the property management company. I told him to arrange a mandatory routine appraisal of the top floor HVAC and structural systems on the exact day of their investor showcase. I told him to list my name as the lead inspector for the appraisal team. David paused. He asked if I was sure about this approach. He said Connor and Andre would recognize me immediately. I told David that was exactly the point. I wanted them to see me in my faded work clothes holding a clipboard and a measuring tape. I wanted them to see the poor, struggling wife forced to take manual inspection jobs just to survive. I wanted them to feel absolute supreme superiority right before the execution. David agreed and initiated the paperwork. The day of the investor showcase arrived. I dressed carefully for the part. I wore a pair of faded khaki work pants and a simple gray polo shirt with the logo of a generic property inspection firm stitched onto the chest. I tied my hair back into a tight, severe bun. I wore scuffed steel-toed boots. I looked exactly like a blue-collar laborer sent to do the dirty work no one else wanted to do. I drove my practical, unassuming sedan to the downtown business district. I parked in the service alley behind the massive glass high-rise that I secretly owned. I walked through the service entrance and took the freight elevator to the top floor. The doors opened to reveal a space transformed. Connor had turned the empty floor into a monument to tech bro arrogance. There were sleek modern workstations, abstract art pieces, and a massive glass-walled conference room overlooking the entire city skyline. Connor and Andre were standing by the reception desk. They were both wearing immaculate tailored suits. They were laughing and checking their expensive watches, waiting for the venture capitalists to arrive. I stepped out of the freight elevator, holding my clipboard. I kept my head down and walked toward the main HVAC utility closet near the conference room. Andre saw me first. The laughter died in his throat. His eyes widened in absolute shock and then immediately narrowed into pure fury. He grabbed Connor by the arm and pointed at me. Connor turned around, his face flushed bright red. He looked at my faded uniform and my scuffed boots. He looked at his pristine luxury office. Andre marched across the floor. He grabbed my arm roughly and pulled me into a side hallway away from the reception area. He demanded to know what I was doing there. He asked if I was stalking him. His voice was a harsh, venomous whisper. I looked down at my clipboard. I kept my voice meek and apologetic. I told him my appraisal firm reassigned me to commercial inspections because of the layoffs. I told him the building management required a mandatory structural check, and I was just trying to keep my job. I looked at him with wide, desperate eyes. I told him I needed the hourly wage. Andre looked at me with profound revulsion. He told me I was a pathetic embarrassment. He said I looked like trash. He told me I had absolutely no right to bring my poverty into his elite professional space. Connor walked into the hallway. He did not bother lowering his voice. He looked at me like I was a diseased animal. He told Andre to get the maid out of his office immediately. Connor said his venture capital partners were arriving in exactly 5 minutes. He said these were men who controlled the global tech market. He said they expected to see a sophisticated high-level operation. He told me that seeing a sweaty working-class black woman measuring baseboards would completely destroy the aesthetic of the environment. He told me I was making the elite partners uncomfortable by simply existing in the same physical space. He pointed to the freight elevator. He told me to pack up my cheap tools and get out of his building. He said if the management company had a problem with it, they could call his lawyers. He told me I was nothing but a distraction to real visionaries. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I nodded obediently. I apologized for interrupting their important day. I turned around and walked slowly back toward the freight elevator. I pressed the call button. I stood there looking at the brushed steel doors. I listened to their footsteps walking back to the reception area. I listened to them congratulating themselves on handling the trash so efficiently. The heavy glass doors of the main entrance slid open. I turned my head just enough to see the reflection in the polished steel of the elevator doors. A group of 5 older white men walked into the lobby. They wore understated suits that cost more than most cars. They carried an aura of absolute unshakable power. These were the venture capitalists. These were the men holding the keys to the kingdom Connor so desperately wanted to enter. Connor and Andre practically tripped over themselves rushing forward to greet the men. Connor extended his hand, flashing his brightest, most arrogant smile. He started his rehearsed pitch welcoming them to the future of technological integration. The lead investor, a man named Harrison, ignored Connor and his outstretched hand completely. Harrison did not look at the custom lighting. He did not look at the expensive Italian leather chairs. His eyes scanned the room and locked directly onto me standing by the freight elevator. Harrison bypassed the reception desk. He walked right past Connor and Andre, leaving them standing with their mouths slightly open in confusion. Harrison walked across the pristine floor. He stopped 3 feet away from me. The entire room went dead silent. Harrison, an elite billionaire venture capitalist, bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound professional respect. He looked at my faded polo shirt and my scuffed boots, and he did not blink. Madam CEO, Harrison said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. It is an absolute honor to finally meet you in person. My partners and I have been following your acquisitions for years. Connor and Andre were standing too far away to hear the exact words. They were busy whispering to each other, trying to figure out why the most powerful man in the room was talking to the blue-collar inspector they had just kicked out. They thought Harrison was complaining about my presence. They thought Harrison was demanding my removal. They had absolutely no idea that Harrison was currently asking the working-class maid for a seat at her private equity table. The weekend passed with Andre floating on a cloud of his own delusion. He walked around the house like a king who had just conquered a new territory. He did not know that his territory belonged entirely to me. He did not know that I owned the walls he was leasing for his fake tech empire. He thought he had outsmarted me and the entire banking system. His arrogance reached an entirely new level when Brianna announced her plans for her 20th birthday. She did not want a simple family dinner. She wanted an extravagant spectacle. She demanded to go to Le Petit Chateau, which was the most exclusive and expensive French restaurant in the entire city of Atlanta. Getting a reservation there usually took 6 months. Andre tipped the maitre d' $500 just to secure a table for Friday night. He was spending my stolen home equity like it was water flowing from an endless spring. He told Brianna she could invite her 3 closest friends. He told her not to worry about the prices on the menu. He said they were about to be wealthier than they had ever imagined. I spent the week perfectly playing my part. I went to my home office every morning and pretended to struggle with minor real estate appraisals. I made sure to look stressed and defeated every time Andre walked past my door. I wanted him to feel secure in his superiority. On Thursday afternoon, I made a very quiet and very secure phone call. I contacted the elite fraud division of the National Bank, where Andre held his primary accounts. the same bank that held the fraudulent home equity line of credit. I did not give them my name. I used a secure digital voice scrambler. I provided them with exact transaction numbers, routing details, and the forged notary identification code. I told them a massive fraudulent loan had been processed, and the funds were currently being dispersed to unverified startup accounts. The fraud department moves incredibly fast when a $1.5 million federal crime is reported. I knew it would take them exactly 24 hours to verify the tip and freeze every single asset connected to Andre. I timed it perfectly. Friday evening arrived. Brianna spent 4 hours getting ready. She wore a skin-tight designer dress that she had purchased using her father and his limitless credit. Her 3 friends arrived in a cloud of cheap perfume and loud voices. They treated my house like a waiting room. They ignored me completely while they took endless photos of themselves in my foyer. Andre came downstairs wearing a brand new custom-tailored tuxedo. He looked at me standing in my simple navy dress. He told me to try not to look so miserable tonight. He said I was lucky he was even letting me come to such an high-class establishment. We drove to the restaurant in 2 separate cars. Andre took Brianna and 2 of her friends in his least luxury sedan. I drove alone with the 3rd friend, who spent the entire ride texting on her phone without looking up once. We arrived at Le Petit Chateau. The valet took my keys. The restaurant was a masterpiece of intimidating wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. The walls were lined with vintage wine bottles behind thick glass. The tables were covered in crisp white linen and heavy silver cutlery. The maitre d' led us to a private booth in the center of the dining room. It was the most visible table in the entire restaurant. Andre wanted everyone to see him playing the billionaire. He sat at the head of the table. Brianna and her friends clustered together on one side. I sat quietly at the opposite end. The waiter handed us menus printed on heavy cardstock. There were no prices listed on the menus handed to the women. Only Andre received the menu with the costs. He waved his hand grandly. He told the waiter to bring them 4 bottles of Dom Perignon immediately. He told Brianna to order whatever she desired. The teenagers did not hold back. They ordered beluga caviar as an appetizer. They ordered imported Wagyu beef flown in directly from Japan. They ordered white truffles shaved over handmade pasta. They ordered things they could not even pronounce simply because Andre told them to go wild. The waiter nodded obsequiously, taking down the massive order with a completely straight face. I ordered a simple garden salad and a glass of still water. Andre looked at me and sneered. He told his daughter that some people simply do not know how to enjoy the finer things in life. Brianna laughed. Her friends giggled. They spent the next 2 hours eating thousands of dollars worth of food and taking hundreds of photos for their social media accounts. They documented every single bite of the caviar. They filmed the waiter shaving the truffles. They made a massive, loud spectacle of themselves. Andre was in his absolute element. He told loud stories about his upcoming business ventures. He hinted broadly to the teenagers that he was about to become a major player in the global tech industry. He said he was securing generational wealth. He said he was building an empire that would make them all untouchable. He looked at me while he spoke, making sure I understood that I was not part of this glorious future. He was completely drunk on his own ego. The dinner dragged on into the late hours of the night. The girls ordered 3 different flaming desserts. They ordered after-dinner espresso and expensive aged cognac that they barely sipped. The table was a disaster of empty crystal glasses, stained white napkins, and half-eaten luxury food. Finally, the moment arrived. Andre snapped his fingers loudly at the waiter. He did not ask for the check. He simply demanded it. The waiter returned a moment later carrying a heavy black leather folder. He placed it discreetly next to Andre. I watched from the end of the table. I saw Andre open the folder. I saw his eyes scan the bottom line. He did not flinch. The bill was just over $5,000. He pulled out his heavy metal black card with a flourish. He dropped it onto the receipt. He handed the folder back to the waiter with a smug smile. He told the waiter to add a 20% tip. The waiter bowed slightly and walked away toward the payment terminal. I took a slow sip of my water. The ice clinked gently against the glass. I counted the seconds in my head. Exactly 3 minutes later, the waiter returned. He did not have the smug smile anymore. He looked incredibly uncomfortable. He leaned down and whispered very quietly into the ear of my husband. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. I knew exactly what he was saying. Andre laughed out loud. He said it was just a simple bank error. He said the fraud department probably flagged the large restaurant charge because he rarely dined there. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a different platinum card. He handed it to the waiter. He told him to run that one instead. The waiter took the second card and walked away. The teenagers were busy looking at their phones, completely oblivious to the shifting atmosphere at the table. Andre shifted in his seat. He loosened his silk tie slightly. A tiny bead of sweat appeared on his forehead. 2 minutes later, the waiter came back. He was accompanied by the restaurant manager. The manager was a tall, intimidating man in a sharp suit. He did not whisper. He stood next to the table and spoke in a low but very clear voice. He informed Andre that the second card had also been declined. He stated that the terminal was returning a specific error code indicating a complete freeze on the accounts. Andre stood up. He was furious. He raised his voice. He demanded that they run the cards again. He said he was a very wealthy man, and their machines were obviously broken. He yelled that he was a prominent wealth manager in the city, and he would ruin their reputation if they embarrassed him in front of his family. The manager remained perfectly calm. He held the 2 plastic cards out to Andre. He politely suggested that Andre contact his financial institution immediately. He stated that a bill of over $5,000 must be settled before they could leave the premises. The entire dining room had gone quiet. The surrounding tables were watching the scene unfold. Wealthy patrons in expensive clothes were staring at the man screaming about his money. Brianna finally looked up from her phone. Her face dropped. Her friends stopped giggling. The illusion of the billionaire tech investor was shattering right in front of their eyes. Andre snatched the cards from the manager. His hands were shaking violently. He looked wildly around the table. He realized he had no other way to pay. His eyes finally landed on me, sitting quietly at the end of the booth. He walked over to me. He leaned down. His breath smelled like old wine and absolute panic. He whispered through clenched teeth. He told me to give him my credit card. He told me to pay the bill right now, and he would transfer the money to me in the morning. He said I needed to save him from this embarrassment. I looked up at him. I did not blink. I kept my voice perfectly level and loud enough for Brianna and her friends to hear every single word. I told him I could not help him. I reminded him that my firm was experiencing massive budget cuts. I told him my real estate appraisal job was hanging by a thread and my accounts were practically empty. I used his exact words from the previous day. I told him I was just a struggling working-class woman who could not possibly afford a $5,000 dinner. Andre stared at me with pure venom. His face twisted into a mask of absolute hatred. He grabbed my arm under the table. His fingers dug painfully into my skin. He ordered me to stop playing games and hand over my card immediately. He called me a useless burden. He said he could not support a failure who refused to help her own husband in a minor crisis. Brianna chimed in. She was humiliated that her friends were witnessing this disaster. She threw her soiled linen napkin directly at my face. It hit my cheek and fell into my lap. She yelled at me to just pay the stupid bill. She said I was ruining her entire birthday and that I was a pathetic excuse for a stepmother. I brushed the dirty napkin off my lap. I stood up slowly. I picked up my small clutch purse. I looked at the restaurant manager. I informed him that I only had a garden salad and a glass of tap water. I reached into my purse and placed a crisp $50 bill on the table. I told the manager that should cover my portion of the meal and a generous tip for the excellent service. I looked at Andre. I told him he should probably call his friend Connor to come bail him out. I told him real tech investors always have liquid capital on hand for emergencies. I turned around and walked away from the table. I heard Brianna start to cry. I heard her friends whispering frantically to each other. I heard the manager asking Andre to step into the back office to discuss payment options. I did not look back. I walked through the crystal chandelier dining room and out the heavy front doors into the cool night air. I handed my ticket to the valet. I waited for my car. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out. It was a message from my private wealth manager, David. The message was short and perfectly precise. David confirmed that the bank had completely locked down every single account connected to Andre and his fraudulent home equity line of credit. The federal fraud investigation was officially open. All funds were frozen. Andre was completely and utterly broke. He had zero access to the stolen $1.5 million. He had zero access to his own savings. He was trapped in a luxury French restaurant with a $5,000 bill he could never pay and a daughter who finally saw him for the pathetic fraud he truly was. I drove back to the estate in complete silence. The night air was thick and heavy with the familiar heat of an Atlanta summer, but inside my car the air conditioning blew ice cold. I kept both hands perfectly still on the leather steering wheel. I watched the streetlights pass by in a steady rhythmic blur. I did not play any music. I did not turn on the radio. I simply let the absolute silence wash over me. For the first time in 5 years, I felt completely awake. I felt like a woman who had finally stepped out of a dense, suffocating fog. I pulled into the wide circular driveway of our brick mansion. The exterior lights illuminated the manicured lawn and the expensive landscaping that Andre loved to brag about. It looked like a monument to success and stability. It was nothing more than a hollow shell built on lies and stolen equity. I walked through the heavy front doors and locked them behind me. The house was completely dark and entirely empty. I did not turn on the main lights. I walked through the quiet hallways, bathed in the soft blue glow of the security panels. I went straight to the kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of cold water. I stood by the marble island where Brianna had deliberately destroyed my laptop just days earlier. I traced my finger over the smooth stone surface. I knew it was only a matter of time before Andre arrived. The bank had locked him out of his own life. The restaurant manager had undoubtedly forced him to sign a promissory note or leave collateral just to exit the building. He was a man who survived purely on image and status. Being humiliated in front of his teenage daughter and her wealthy friends was a fate worse than death for someone with an ego as fragile as his. It took him exactly 47 minutes to get home. I heard his car tires screech against the pavement of the driveway. I heard the aggressive, heavy thud of his car door slamming shut. The front door of the house did not just open, it violently crashed against the interior wall. He stormed into the grand foyer, breathing like a cornered animal. His custom-tailored tuxedo jacket was completely unbuttoned. His silk tie was ripped from his collar and hung loosely around his neck. His face was slick with sweat, and his eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. He saw me standing in the kitchen, illuminated by the soft light over the stove. He marched directly toward me. His heavy dress shoes slapped loudly against the hardwood floors. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not apologize for his behavior at the restaurant. He went straight on the attack because an offensive strike was the only defense mechanism he truly understood. He screamed that I was an absolute embarrassment. He yelled that a real wife, a supportive partner, would have handed over her credit card without a second thought to save her husband from public humiliation. He paced back and forth across the kitchen floor, throwing his arms wildly in the air. He blamed me for the declined cards. He said the fraud department only flagged his accounts because I had failed to properly update the residential security protocols on our joint profiles. He twisted reality into a bizarre knot just to avoid taking an ounce of responsibility. He told me I was nothing but a useless burden. He said I dragged down his legacy with my working-class mentality and my petty refusal to help him in a moment of minor crisis. He said he was trying to build generational wealth for our family, and I was actively standing in his way. He screamed so loud the veins in his neck bulged against his dark skin. I stood there and drank my water. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I looked at him with the same detached observation one might use to study a dying insect. My absolute calm only fueled his irrational rage. Andre turned toward the large wooden drying rack sitting next to the sink. It held a stack of imported Italian ceramic dinner plates. Vivian had given them to us as a wedding gift. They were expensive and delicate. Andre grabbed the top plate with both hands and hurled it directly against the marble island. The ceramic shattered with a deafening crack. Razor-sharp shards exploded across the room and rained down on the hardwood floor. He grabbed another plate and threw it. He grabbed a third and smashed it against the stainless steel refrigerator. He was completely out of control. He was throwing a massive, violent temper tantrum because the universe had finally told him no. He destroyed 6 expensive plates before he finally ran out of breath. He stood panting over the wreckage of broken porcelain. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and told me I ruined his entire night. My phone began to vibrate violently on the kitchen counter. The bright screen illuminated the dark space. The caller identification showed the name Vivian. Andre saw the name on the screen. A cruel, desperate smile spread across his sweating face. He pointed at the phone and ordered me to answer it. He told me to put the device on speaker. He said he wanted me to hear exactly what his mother thought of my pathetic behavior. He wanted his mother to validate his rage. I reached out and swiped the screen. I tapped the speaker icon. I did not say hello. Vivian did not wait for a greeting. She immediately began screaming through the tiny speaker. Her voice was shrill and laced with venom. She had obviously spoken to Brianna. She knew exactly what happened at the restaurant. She called me a useless wife. She said I was a low-class mistake that her brilliant son never should have married. Vivian said Andre gave me a beautiful life that I completely squandered. She yelled that I was supposed to be a supportive domestic partner, but I could not even do that correctly. She demanded to know why I allowed her son to be humiliated in front of prestigious guests. She said my refusal to pay the bill was an act of pure selfish disrespect. She told me I was entirely replaceable and that Andre could find a younger, wealthier woman tomorrow if he wanted to. She screamed that I brought absolutely nothing of value to their proud family name. I let her scream. I let her exhaust her vocabulary of insults. I listened to her tear me apart while her son stood across the kitchen nodding in agreement with every single word. When she finally stopped to take a breath, I simply reached out and ended the call. I tapped the red button. The kitchen fell into a heavy, ringing silence. Andre stared at me. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg for forgiveness or pack my bags in shame. He expected the working-class woman he married to finally break under the crushing weight of their combined disapproval. I did not break. I walked over to the utility closet. I opened the door and pulled out the tall wooden broom and the metal dustpan. Andre let out a sound of pure disgust. He shook his head and muttered that I was acting like a psychopath. He turned his back on me and stormed out of the kitchen. He marched heavily up the grand staircase. I heard him walk into the master bedroom. I heard the heavy wooden door slam shut with so much force that the framed pictures on the hallway walls rattled against the plaster. I was entirely alone in the kitchen. The floor was covered in the jagged remains of Vivian and her expensive wedding gifts. I swept the floors. I picked up the shattered plates. I gathered his rage. I cleaned the house. I cleaned my life. I swept the floors. I picked up the shattered plates. I gathered his rage. I cleaned the house. I cleaned my life. I moved the broom rhythmically across the hardwood. I gathered the sharp white fragments into a neat pile. The physical repetition calmed my mind. Every sweep of the bristles was a methodical erasure of my past. Every broken piece of ceramic sliding into the metal dustpan was a piece of my old existence being permanently discarded. I did not feel sad. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly light. I dumped the broken plates into the large garbage bin. I wiped the marble counter until it shined perfectly in the dim light. I put the broom away. The house was dead quiet. It was past 2 in the morning. I walked down the hall and entered my home office. I locked the heavy door behind me. I sat down at my desk and opened my new encrypted laptop. The screen glowed brightly in the pitch-black room. I opened a secure communication protocol and dialed my private wealth manager. David answered on the very first ring. He sounded completely alert and ready to work despite the late hour. We did not waste time with pleasantries. We had a massive operation to finalize. Andre thought his accounts were simply frozen due to a standard internal fraud investigation. He thought the bank would eventually clear the misunderstanding and restore his access. He believed he was just facing a temporary inconvenience. He had absolutely no idea how the high finance world actually handled toxic fraudulent assets. Banks do not want the liability of forged massive loans sitting on their books. When a $1.5 million home equity line of credit is flagged for severe federal fraud, the bank moves to isolate the damage. They package the bad debt and immediately attempt to sell it off to private equity firms at a steep discount to clear their ledgers. It is a standard procedure to mitigate risk. David had been monitoring the banking channels all evening. He told me the bank officially classified Andre and his fraudulent loan as a distressed, toxic asset. The bank wanted to wipe their hands clean of the entire mess before the federal investigation deepened. I told David to execute the shadow transaction. I told him to authorize the purchase. My private equity firm used an anonymous subsidiary holding company to approach the bank. We offered to buy the distressed debt entirely in cash. We offered to take the toxic asset completely off their hands. The bank accepted the offer immediately. They transferred the paperwork, the digital files, and the ownership rights without asking a single question about the anonymous buyer. I sat in my dark office listening to David type rapidly on his keyboard. He read the confirmation codes aloud. He verified the transfer numbers. He confirmed that the transaction was officially complete and legally binding. The shadow transaction took less than 10 minutes to process. My private equity firm officially purchased the $1.5 million bad debt directly from the bank. The original lenders washed their hands of my husband completely. David told me the paperwork was fully executed. He told me the deed was done. He asked if I needed anything else before he signed off for the night. I thanked him for his flawless work. I ended the call. I closed my laptop. The room plunged back into complete darkness. I sat in my leather chair and stared at the shadows on the wall. The game had fundamentally changed. I was no longer just the stepmother they hated. I was no longer just the quiet wife they deeply disrespected and constantly humiliated. I was no longer the simple appraiser they thought they could easily manipulate and destroy. I was now the sole legal owner of my husband and his massive inescapable debt. I owned the fraudulent loan. I owned the financial chains wrapping tightly around his neck. He thought he was playing the role of a brilliant tech investor securing a glorious future for his entitled family. He was actually standing right in the center of a trap I had personally designed and paid for. I held the deed to his ruin, and I was completely ready to tear his entire world apart. Harrison stood before me waiting for my answer. He did not care about my faded uniform. He did not care about my scuffed boots. He only cared about the billions of dollars my firm controlled. I looked at the powerful venture capitalist and nodded slowly. I told him we could schedule a private meeting next week. I told him my portfolio was always open to the right investors. Harrison smiled warmly. He handed me his solid gold business card. He said he would wait for my call. Andre and Connor could no longer stand the suspense. They saw the golden business card change hands. They saw the respectful smile on the face of the billionaire. Their fragile egos could not process the visual information. They practically sprinted across the polished floor. Connor was out of breath. He pushed his way past me and stood directly in front of Harrison. He started apologizing profusely. Connor said he was deeply sorry that the building maintenance staff was bothering the elite guests. Connor said he had already ordered me to leave the premises. He called me a rogue cleaning woman who did not know her place. Harrison looked at Connor. His expression shifted from warm respect to absolute freezing confusion. Harrison looked at me and then back to Connor. Harrison stated clearly that there was no cleaning woman present. Connor laughed nervously. He said there was no joke and he was just trying to keep the trash out of the boardroom. Harrison did not laugh. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. Harrison stepped away from Connor as if the man was carrying a highly contagious disease. Harrison looked at Andre and Connor with pure disgust. He told Connor that he was speaking to the chief executive officer of the largest private equity firm in the Southeast. Harrison told Connor that the woman in the faded polo shirt owned the very building they were standing in. Connor froze. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him a pale, sickly white. He looked at me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Andre stepped forward. He tried to laugh. He grabbed my arm. Andre told Harrison there must be a huge misunderstanding. Andre said I was just his wife. Andre said I was just a lowly real estate appraiser who could barely afford groceries. Andre said I was having a mental breakdown. I pulled my arm out of the grip of my husband. I did not look like the obedient domestic wife anymore. I stood up straight. I looked Andre directly in his eyes. I told him the game was over. I told him there was no misunderstanding. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the clear plastic evidence bag containing the microscopic keystroke logger. I held it up so the overhead lights caught the jagged edges of the broken chip. I told Andre that my forensic specialist found his little toy. I told him I knew exactly how he forged my signature to pull $1.5 million out of my house. The venture capitalists behind Harrison started whispering to each other. They were men who dealt in risk management. They immediately smelled the toxic stench of massive federal fraud. Harrison took another step back. He crossed his arms over his chest. He watched the execution happen right in front of him. I turned my attention to Connor. Connor was shaking. I told Connor that his brilliant tech startup was entirely funded by stolen money. I told Connor that the bank had frozen all the assets and opened a federal investigation. I told him his massive capital injection was nothing but a criminal illusion. Connor tried to speak. He tried to claim he had absolutely no idea where Andre got the money. He tried to throw Andre under the bus immediately. I told Connor it did not matter what he knew. I told him I was the sole owner of the holding company that owned this high-rise building. I looked around the expensive luxury office he had just designed. I told him his lease was officially terminated effectively immediately due to criminal activity on the premises. I told him he had exactly 10 minutes to pack up his laptop and get off my property before I had the security team physically throw him into the street. Harrison and his partners turned around. They did not say a single word. They simply walked back toward the glass elevator. Connor chased after them. He begged them to stay. He promised he could explain the financial irregularities. Harrison did not even turn his head. The elevator doors closed. Connor was left standing in the empty lobby, completely ruined. His business was dead. His funding was gone. His reputation in the tech world was permanently destroyed. I turned back to Andre. My husband looked like a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse into dust. He was sweating profusely. His custom tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume. He fell to his knees right there on the polished concrete floor. He did not care who was watching. He grabbed my hands. He begged me to listen to him. He cried. Real tears rolled down his face. He said he only did it for our family. He said he wanted to be worthy of me. He said he would pay back every single penny if I just gave him another chance. He said he loved me. I looked down at the man kneeling in front of me. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, just a profound, sweeping emptiness. I pulled my hands away. I told Andre that love does not forge signatures. I told him love does not install spyware on a private workstation. I told him love does not treat a partner like a disposable maid while stealing their financial future. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. I dropped it onto the floor right in front of his knees. I told him it was the legal documentation from my private equity firm. I told him my firm had officially purchased his fraudulent debt from the bank. I told him I was now his sole creditor. I owned his debt. I owned his future. I told Andre that the federal authorities were already waiting downstairs in the main lobby. I told him his wealth management firm had been notified of his criminal actions and his professional license was being permanently revoked. I told him he had nothing left to manage. I turned my back on him. He screamed my name. He sobbed loudly, echoing through the empty luxury office. I did not look back. I walked to the private executive elevator. I pressed the button. The doors opened. I stepped inside and let the doors close on the pathetic sounds of a broken man. I drove back to the estate in Cascade. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and gold. I pulled into the driveway. Vivian and Brianna were sitting by the pool. They had drinks in their hands. They were laughing. They thought they were untouchable royalty. I walked out to the patio. I did not wear my faded polo shirt anymore. I had changed into a sharp-tailored suit I kept in my office. I looked like the CEO I truly was. Vivian saw me and immediately started complaining. She asked why I was wearing business clothes when I should be preparing dinner. Brianna rolled her eyes and told me to fetch her another towel. I stood at the edge of the pool. I looked at the two women who had made my life a miserable hell. I told them Andre had been arrested for federal bank fraud. The glass slipped from the hand of Vivian and shattered on the stone patio. Brianna stopped laughing. I told them Andre was bankrupt and facing years in federal prison. I told them this house belonged entirely to me, and the fraudulent loan had been seized. Vivian started to hyperventilate. She clutched her oversized pearl necklace. She demanded to know what was going to happen to her. She asked who was going to pay for her lifestyle. Brianna started screaming that I had ruined their family. She called me a monster. I looked at them with absolute calm. I told them they had exactly 1 hour to pack their belongings. I told them if they were still on my property in 61 minutes, I would have them arrested for trespassing. I told Brianna she could take her expensive silk blouses and iron them herself. I told Vivian she could go find another working-class woman to treat like garbage. They tried to argue. They tried to beg. They tried to use guilt. I simply set a timer on my phone and placed it on the patio table. The digital numbers started counting down. They looked at the timer and realized I was completely serious. Panic set in. They ran inside the house. I heard them scrambling up the stairs. I heard them frantically throwing items into suitcases. They pushed past each other trying to grab whatever valuables they could carry. 59 minutes later, they dragged their heavy bags out the front door. They stood in the driveway looking completely lost. They had no money. They had no status. They had nowhere to go. I locked the heavy oak doors. I engaged the security system. I walked through my quiet, pristine house. I poured myself a glass of vintage Cabernet. I did not spill a single drop. I sat in my beautiful living room and listened to the absolute perfect silence of a clean life. I looked at Harrison and nodded slightly. I told him my assistant would contact his office to arrange a private meeting. I turned around and walked back toward the freight elevator. I pressed the heavy metal button. The doors slid open and I stepped inside. I watched through the closing doors as Andre and Connor rushed forward to apologize to the billionaire. They were bowing their heads and wringing their hands. They were completely oblivious to the empire shifting beneath their feet. They truly believed Harrison was demanding my removal. They truly believed their path to extreme wealth was perfectly secure. I drove back to the suburban house and resumed my role. I put on a faded apron and started scrubbing the kitchen counters. 2 hours later, Andre burst through the front door. He was practically vibrating with aggressive energy. He threw his leather briefcase onto the hallway table. He shouted for Brianna to come downstairs immediately. He told her the showcase was a monumental triumph. He said the biggest venture capitalist in the city was ready to fund their entire operation. He said they were about to be swimming in liquid capital. Brianna ran down the stairs and squealed with delight. She hugged her father and told him he was a genius. She said this was the perfect timing because her 20th birthday was tomorrow. She said she did not want a regular party. She demanded a massive, lavish dinner at an exclusive high-end restaurant downtown. She said she wanted to invite her 3 wealthiest friends to prove that her family was finally reaching the elite tier of society. Andre did not hesitate. He pulled out his phone and made a reservation at the most expensive steakhouse in the city. He told Brianna to buy a new dress and not to worry about the price tag. He walked into the kitchen and saw me wiping down the sink. He sneered at my faded clothes. He told me to find something decent to wear because I was coming with them. He said he wanted me to sit at the table and watch what real success looks like. He wanted to rub his imaginary victory directly into my face. I kept my head down and nodded obediently. I told him I would be ready. I went up to my small room and selected a plain gray dress. I made sure I looked unremarkable and tired. I made sure I looked exactly like a woman who had completely given up on life. The next evening, we drove to the restaurant in his leased luxury car. Brianna and her friends sat in the back seat loudly discussing designer handbags and luxury vacations. They completely ignored my presence. We arrived at the restaurant and the valet opened our doors. The interior was dripping with crystal chandeliers and gold accents. It was a place designed specifically to separate arrogant men from their money. The host led us to a large circular booth in the center of the dining room. Andre ordered 2 bottles of vintage champagne before we even looked at the menus. He told the girls to order whatever they wanted. Brianna and her friends laughed and pointed at the most expensive items. They ordered imported caviar and massive dry-aged steaks. They ordered white truffles and exotic seafood towers. They treated the menu like a bottomless wishing well. I ordered a simple salad and a glass of tap water. Andre rolled his eyes and told his daughter that some people simply lack the capacity for greatness. He spent the entire dinner bragging about his tech startup. He spoke loudly so the surrounding tables could hear him. He used words like synergy and explosive growth and market domination. He was putting on a pathetic performance for a dining room full of strangers. The dinner lasted for 3 agonizing hours. The girls ordered massive elaborate desserts and more champagne. They took dozens of pictures for their social media accounts, making sure to capture the opulent spread. They wanted the entire world to know how rich they were. Finally, the waiter approached the table and placed a heavy leather folder next to Andre. The bill was over $5,000. Andre did not even flinch. He wanted to show off his absolute financial power. He casually reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out his heavy metal black card. He dropped it onto the small silver tray with a smug smile. He told the waiter to add a 20% gratuity. The waiter nodded politely and walked away toward the payment terminal. Andre leaned back in his chair and unbuttoned his jacket. He looked at me and asked if I enjoyed seeing how the other half lives. I took a slow sip of my water and told him it was very educational. 5 minutes passed. The waiter did not return. The smug smile on the face of my husband began to falter slightly. He checked his expensive watch and muttered about the slow service. A few more minutes passed, and the restaurant manager walked toward our table. He was a tall man with a severe expression. He was holding the black metal card in his hand. The manager leaned down and spoke in a very low, discreet voice. He informed Andre that the card had been declined. He asked if there was another method of payment available. Andre turned bright red. He loudly declared that the machine must be broken. He said the card had a limitless balance and the bank was probably just verifying the large charge. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a different platinum credit card. He slapped it into the hand of the manager and told him to hurry up because he had important places to be. The manager walked away again. Brianna looked up from her phone. She asked her father what was taking so long. Andre forced a tight smile and told her it was just a minor technical issue. He was starting to sweat. The collar of his shirt looked suddenly too tight. The manager returned 3 minutes later. He did not lean down this time. He stood completely straight and spoke loudly enough for the entire booth to hear. He stated that the second card had also been completely declined. He said the payment terminal was showing a severe error code, indicating a total freeze on all accounts. The girls stopped laughing. The table went dead silent. The wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables turned their heads to watch the drama unfold. Public humiliation was settling heavily over the center of the dining room. Andre panicked. He stood up and slammed his hands on the table. He shouted that he was a senior wealth manager and they were making a massive mistake. He demanded they call his bank immediately. The restaurant manager remained perfectly calm. He told Andre that a bill of $5,000 must be settled before anyone could leave the premises. He suggested they step into the back office to discuss the matter privately. Brianna was mortified. Her friends were staring at her with wide eyes. The illusion of their massive wealth was shattering violently in public. Brianna grabbed the arm of her father and begged him to just pay the bill and get them out of there. Andre looked completely trapped. He pulled out every card in his wallet, but he knew they were all connected to the same frozen profile. His eyes darted around the table and finally landed on me. His panic morphed into aggressive entitlement. He pointed at me and ordered me to give him my credit card. He told me to pay the bill right now and he would reimburse me in the morning. He said I needed to act like a supportive wife and save him from this ridiculous embarrassment. His voice was loud and harsh, echoing through the quiet restaurant. I looked at him with absolute profound calm. I did not reach into my purse. I did not move a single muscle. I told him no. Andre stared at me like I had just spoken a foreign language. He demanded to know what I meant. He ordered me to hand over my card immediately. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told him I could not pay a $5,000 dinner bill. I reminded him that he controlled all the household finances. I reminded him that he constantly called me a useless failure who brought no money into the home. I looked directly at Brianna and her wealthy friends. I told them I was just a struggling appraiser who could barely afford basic groceries because my husband refused to support me. Andre turned a deep shade of purple. His rage exploded in front of the entire restaurant. He called me a pathetic, worthless burden. He said I was intentionally trying to destroy his family. He screamed that I was embarrassing him on purpose. The restaurant manager stepped forward and told Andre he needed to lower his voice or security would be called. I stood up slowly. I picked up my plain gray purse. I looked at the manager and told him I only had a side salad and a glass of tap water. I placed a $50 bill on the table. I told the manager that covered my portion of the meal. I looked down at my husband, who was currently being escorted toward the back office by two large security guards. I told Andre he should call his elite business partners to come bail him out. I turned my back on the screaming man and the crying teenager. I walked calmly through the dining room and out the front doors into the cool night air. I climbed into a waiting taxi and looked out the window as we drove away. I did not feel an ounce of pity. Andre was currently experiencing the devastating reality of a complete asset freeze. His cards were declining because the bank had completely locked down his entire financial existence. His accounts were frozen solid due to a direct report of highly suspicious fraudulent activity involving a massive home equity loan. The bank fraud department acted swiftly to protect their assets. They froze every single dollar connected to his name while they launched a full federal investigation. Andre had absolutely no idea why his life was suddenly collapsing around him. He had no idea who could have possibly tipped off the fraud department with such exact internal banking codes. He did not know that the anonymous informant who triggered the complete destruction of his financial world was his quiet, obedient wife. The morning sun broke through the windows of my luxury hotel suite. I had not slept much, but I did not feel tired. The text message I sent to my lawyer the night before was the final domino falling into place. The foreclosure process was officially initiated. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and carefully dressed for the day that would redefine the rest of my life. I did not wear a faded polo shirt. I did not wear a cheap uniform. I put on a flawless charcoal gray power suit tailored perfectly to my frame. The fabric was imported silk and wool. It draped over my shoulders with absolute authority. I slipped my feet into sharp black designer stilettos. I pulled my hair back into a sleek tight twist at the nape of my neck. I applied my makeup with cold precision. I looked exactly like the apex predator of the financial world that I had built myself to be. My phone buzzed with a message from David. The bank confirmed the transfer of the bad debt was absolute. The trap was fully set and armed. Across town, Andre and Connor were likely doing the exact same thing. They were putting on their expensive tailored suits and adjusting their silk ties. They were preparing for the final funding pitch at the private equity firm that would supposedly launch their tech empire into the stratosphere. David had sent me the security feed from the lobby of my firm. I watched them walk through the revolving glass doors. They swaggered into the building, with their chests puffed out and their chins held high. Connor was laughing and clapping Andre on the back. Andre looked around the massive marble lobby with absolute greed in his eyes. He thought he was walking into a place that would bow down to his genius. He thought the $1.5 million he stole from my house was his golden ticket to the Billionaire Boys Club. They approached the reception desk with supreme arrogance. Andre spoke down to the receptionist, demanding to be shown to the executive boardroom immediately. He acted like he already owned the building. He told the receptionist that they were there to see the chairman of the board to finalize a massive tech acquisition. The receptionist smiled politely and led them to the top floor. She brought them into the main glass-walled conference room overlooking the entire city skyline. David told me they immediately started treating the space like a playground. Connor leaned back in the imported leather chair and put his expensive shoes directly on the polished glass table. Andre poured himself a glass of sparkling water and started pacing the room, rehearsing his pitch. He was talking loudly about how easily they had secured their seed money. He bragged to Connor about how he had manipulated his pathetic wife to get the house and the credit line. He said I was probably back at the suburban house crying on the floor and begging for his forgiveness. He said I was a weak, useless woman who would never amount to anything. I drove my sleek black sports car into the city. I bypassed the public parking garage and pulled into the underground executive bay. The security gates opened smoothly for my vehicle. I took the private elevator directly to the top floor of the high-rise. The doors opened to my real domain. The offices of my private equity firm were sprawling and immaculate. The walls were lined with modern art, and the floors were covered in thick, rich carpets. My staff nodded respectfully as I walked down the hallway. They knew the chairman was in the building, and they knew we were about to execute a major hostile takeover. David met me inside my private office. He handed me a thick manila folder containing every piece of evidence we had gathered. He handed me the original forged loan documents with the fake signature Andre had created. He handed me the bank transfer records showing the exact path of the stolen $1.5 million. He handed me the legal deed proving my firm now owned the entirety of the toxic debt. David told me that Andre and Connor had just entered the building lobby. He pulled up the security camera feed on the massive monitor on my wall. We stood together and watched them walk through the revolving glass doors. Andre was wearing his expensive new suit. Connor was walking beside him, looking smug and overconfident. They strutted across the marble lobby like they were masters of the universe. They did not look like men who were carrying massive fraudulent debt. They looked like men who believed their own delusions. They thought the $1.5 million they stole from my house made them invincible. They thought they were walking into a room full of eager investors ready to hand them the keys to a global empire. I watched as they approached the front desk. Andre leaned casually against the counter and spoke down to the receptionist. He told her they were there for the final funding pitch with the executive board. He demanded to be taken to the main boardroom immediately. He acted as though the entire firm should stop and bow to his presence. The receptionist smiled politely and called for an associate to escort them to the top floor. David and I watched the camera feed as they exited the elevator and were led down the long corridor toward the main executive boardroom. The boardroom was a massive space with floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the entire city skyline. A long, polished glass table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by imported leather chairs. It was designed to intimidate and impress. Andre and Connor walked into the boardroom and immediately claimed the space as their own. Connor threw his leather briefcase onto the glass table. He pulled out a chair and slouched down, placing his expensive shoes directly onto the polished surface. Andre walked over to the massive window and looked out over the city. He poured himself a glass of sparkling water from the crystal pitcher on the sideboard. David increased the volume on the hidden room microphones so we could hear their conversation. Andre was laughing. He told Connor that they had completely won the game. He bragged about how easily he had outsmarted the banking system. He boasted about forging the documents and pulling the equity directly out of my house right under my nose. He said I was so stupid and so desperate for his approval that I never even checked the mail or monitored the property records. He told Connor that I was probably back at the suburban house right now, crying on the floor after the fight they had the night before. Connor laughed loudly. He said it was brilliant how they used the stolen money to lease the fake office space and buy the luxury furniture. He said the venture capitalists they met yesterday were completely fooled by the aesthetic. Connor told Andre that as soon as this private equity firm handed over the second round of funding, they would be completely untouchable. Connor sneered and said he could not wait to see the look on my face when they finally kicked me out of the house for good. Andre agreed. He said I was a useless, working-class burden, and he was ready to dump me the second the ink dried on the new contracts. I listened to every word. I listened to my husband outline his plan to destroy me while he stood in my building waiting to ask for my money. I did not feel a trace of anger. I felt the cold, calculated precision of an executioner stepping up to the block. I turned to David. I told him it was time. David gathered his legal pads and followed me out of my office. We walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the executive boardroom. My stilettos sank silently into the thick fabric. I stopped just outside the heavy double oak doors. I could still hear their arrogant voices echoing from the other side. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket. I held the thick manila folder firmly in my left hand. I took one slow, deep breath, letting the perfect silence of my power settle into my bones. I reached out and pushed the heavy oak doors open. The doors swung wide, and the ambient noise in the boardroom instantly died. The room went completely silent. I walked through the threshold and stepped onto the hardwood border of the room. My sharp heels clicked loudly with every step. Connor was the first to see me. He immediately dropped his feet from the glass table. He sat up straight and his face twisted into an ugly mask of revulsion. He looked at me in my tailored suit and then looked past me, expecting a security guard to follow me inside. Connor stood up and pointed his finger directly at my face. He raised his voice and demanded to know what the hell the cleaning lady was doing in the executive boardroom. Connor yelled that this was a secure floor and I had no right to be there. He told me to take my trash and get out before he called the police. He looked at Andre and shook his head in absolute disgust. Connor said he could not believe a firm this wealthy would let uneducated blue-collar workers wander the halls during vital corporate meetings. He sneered that my presence was making him and his elite partners deeply uncomfortable. He told me to get out of his sight immediately. Andre finally turned around from the massive window. The smug, arrogant smile melted completely off his face. He stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. His brain violently struggled to process the visual information in front of him. He was looking at the woman he thought was a broke, pathetic appraiser, but she was standing in the most powerful room in the city, wearing a suit that cost more than his car. Andre marched across the room. He stopped 3 feet away from me. His chest was heaving. His voice was a low, venomous hiss, vibrating with pure panic. He asked me if I was stalking him. He demanded to know how I got past the security desk downstairs. He told me I was embarrassing him for the final time. He said if I did not turn around and walk out those oak doors right this second, he would have me locked in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life. He raised his hand as if he was going to grab my arm and throw me out himself. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not break eye contact. I walked right past my husband. I moved steadily toward the head of the long glass table. I pulled out the massive leather chair reserved specifically for the chairman of the board. I sat down gracefully. I crossed my legs and placed my hands flat on the cool glass surface. I looked at Andre and Connor, who were both standing frozen in a state of absolute, total confusion. Andre lost his mind. He marched over to the table and slammed his fist down hard against the glass. He yelled that I was having a psychotic break. He told Connor to call the reception desk right now and have me forcibly dragged out of the building. He screamed that I was a pathetic, delusional woman who could not handle the reality of our divorce and was now trying to ruin his business deals out of pure spite. He called me crazy. He called me garbage. The side door of the boardroom opened quietly. David walked into the room carrying a stack of legal files. He ignored Andre completely. David walked straight over to where I was sitting. He bowed his head slightly in a gesture of deep professional respect. He placed the files neatly in front of me and took a step back. David looked at the two sweating, screaming men. His voice was calm and commanding. He introduced himself as the senior managing partner of the firm. David then gestured toward me with an open hand. He told Andre and Connor that they needed to lower their voices immediately. He told them it was his distinct honor to introduce them to the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole chairman of the board of this private equity firm. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was heavy and thick and absolute. The color drained completely from the face of my husband. He turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. His mouth hung open in silent, horrifying realization. He looked at David, and then he slowly turned his head to look at me. He tried to speak, but the words caught and died in his dry throat. His knees wobbled slightly as the staggering, crushing weight of the truth finally crashed down onto his arrogant shoulders. He realized he was not looking at a broken wife. He was looking at a titan. Connor looked like he was about to vomit. He staggered backward until his shoulders hit the wall. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for an exit that did not exist. They finally realized they were not pitching their fake company to a room full of naive, hopeful investors. They realized they were standing helplessly in the slaughterhouse of the very woman they had treated like disposable garbage for months. I looked at my husband as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I kept my face completely devoid of emotion. I reached into the thick manila folder I had brought with me. I slowly pulled out the original forged loan documents, the exact paperwork that authorized the theft of $1.5 million from my estate. I pulled out the transfer deed showing that my private equity firm now owned every single penny of his toxic bad debt. I raised my arm and tossed the heavy stack of forged documents directly onto the center of the glass table. They landed with a heavy final thud that echoed like a gunshot through the silent boardroom. Andre stared at the papers and then stared at me. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to work. The arrogant sneer on Connor had completely vanished from his face. He looked at the documents and slowly reached out a trembling hand. He turned over the first page. His eyes scanned the highlighted bank transfer codes and the obvious fake signature that my forensic team had so easily verified. I did not give them a moment to breathe or formulate a lie. I looked directly at Connor. I told him he was an absolute fool for trusting a man like my husband. I told Connor that his brilliant tech startup was nothing but an illusion. I explained that his entire funding was stolen money. I told him the $1.5 million sitting in his corporate account was the direct result of federal bank fraud and identity theft. I watched the blood drain completely out of his face, leaving him a pale, sickly white. Connor started shaking his head back and forth. He tried to physically back away from the table. He stammered that he had absolutely no idea where the money came from. He claimed he was completely innocent and was just trying to build a software company. I told Connor it did not matter what he knew or what he thought he knew. I told him the money was already frozen by the bank and seized pending a federal investigation. I told him his company was completely bankrupt before it even launched its first product. Connor looked around the expensive boardroom. His breathing was fast and shallow. He begged me to separate his business from my marital problems. He pleaded with me to let him keep his office lease in the city so he could try to find new legitimate investors to save his sinking ship. I looked around the immaculate room and let out a soft, cold laugh. I told Connor he clearly did not read the property records when he signed his commercial lease. I told him that my private equity firm owned the entire commercial complex where his fake startup was currently located. I told him he was standing in my building right now and his fancy new office was sitting in another one of my buildings just 3 blocks away. I told Connor his lease was officially terminated effective immediately due to criminal activity on the premises. I looked at my watch. I gave him exactly 10 minutes to pack up his laptop and get off my property before my security team physically threw him into the street. Connor did not attempt to argue. He grabbed his leather briefcase with shaking hands. He looked at Andre with pure, unadulterated hatred. He called my husband a pathetic criminal who ruined his life. Connor ran out of the boardroom, leaving his dreams of a tech empire shattered on the floor. The heavy doors closed behind him. I turned my full attention back to Andre. My husband was sweating profusely. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume. He looked like a man who was watching his entire universe collapse into dust. His legs gave out and he fell to his knees right there on the polished hardwood floor. He did not care that David was watching. He grabbed the edge of the glass table and begged me to listen to him. He started crying real tears. He said he only forged the documents because he wanted to be a massive success for me. He said he wanted to give us a better life and be a husband I could be proud of. He promised he would pay back every single penny if I just gave him another chance and stopped the investigation. I looked down at the man kneeling in front of me. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity in my chest. There was no anger left in my heart. There was just a profound, sweeping emptiness. I told Andre that love does not forge signatures. I told him love does not steal a financial future to fund a pathetic delusion. I pointed to the documents on the table. I told him my firm had officially purchased his fraudulent debt from the bank. I was now his sole creditor. I owned his debt and therefore I owned his future. Andre sobbed loudly. The sound echoed off the glass walls. He asked me what I was going to do to him. He begged me not to take everything he had left. I told him he already had nothing left. I leaned forward and looked directly into his red eyes. I told him I was officially foreclosing on the marital home. I told him the house in the suburbs was being seized immediately to cover the stolen funds. I told him he was going to be left with absolutely nothing. He screamed my name. He begged for mercy. He said I was destroying his life. I did not answer him. I just looked toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. The doors opened again. 3 men in dark windbreakers walked into the room. The gold badges on their belts caught the light from the massive windows. They were federal agents. They walked straight past David and stood directly behind my kneeling husband. Andre froze. The tears stopped falling. He looked over his shoulder at the agents. The lead agent read him his rights in a cold, mechanical voice. He stated they held a federal warrant for his arrest. He listed the charges clearly so there could be no misunderstanding. Massive wire fraud and federal document forgery. The agents grabbed his arms and pulled him roughly to his feet. They pulled his arms behind his back and locked cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click echoed loudly through the silent room. Andre looked at me one last time as they dragged him toward the door. His eyes were wide with sheer terror and disbelief. He shouted that I was a monster. He screamed that I had planned this all along to destroy him. I simply sat in my expensive leather chair and watched them pull him out of the boardroom. The heavy oak doors closed behind him, shutting out the pathetic sounds of a ruined man. I sat in the perfect silence of my boardroom. David stood quietly in the corner, gathering the files from the table. I looked out the massive windows at the city skyline spread out below me. The empire I had built in secret was finally secure. The toxic weight of my marriage was completely gone. I took a deep breath of the cool air conditioning. The game was over. My life was finally clean and quiet, and entirely my own. True power doesn't come from loud arrogance or stolen wealth. It comes from silent preparation, knowing your absolute worth, and refusing to let toxic people dictate your reality. You never have to tolerate abuse disguised as family or love. Sometimes the most profound act of self-care is simply walking away and letting the consequences handle the rest. Never apologize for taking back your power and protecting your peace. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic people to rebuild your life? Share your story of resilience in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more empowering content.